But we'll go ahead and get started in this next panel. I think we can just go across the table and you can introduce yourself and what organization you represent, and yeah, and then we'll get into it.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. My name is Rebecca Sobel. I'm the Senior Climate and Energy Campaigner for Wild Earth Guardians. We're based in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Everybody, my name is Maya King-Flaherty, and I'm the Our Wild New Mexico organizer for the Sierra Club Rio Grande chapter in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And I'm Samantha Ruscavage-Bars. I'm the managing attorney for Wild Earth Guardians and in charge of all of Wild Earth Guardians litigation.
Yes, so all these awesome ladies are part of the Back Off Chaco coalition. This coalition is probably over 100 different organizations, I think internationally, right? So it's just shows that collective effort in the protection of the greater Chaco region. So just to open up this panel, I just wanted to ask our panelists, what have they been working on as far as policy, administrative or legal efforts within like your organization and your own personal position within the greater Chaco protection movement?
Well, I think just before starting, it's kind of important to understand how like the different regulatory authorities that oversee oil and gas development in New Mexico kind of operate. And I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about that, how it works from the federal process through to the state regulations, and also kind of more local municipality levels. But as you've heard, the federal agency that oversees public lands and tribal lands is called the BLM, and they're underneath the Department of Interior. And they're supposed to manage lands for multiple uses, so for recreation, environmental conservation, scientific study, grazing, but then also for mining as well. And under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the National Historic Preservation Act, for any type of mining activity or development that the BLM wants to allow happen in these spaces, they must develop what's called a resource management plan. You might have heard the acronym RMP. And in northwestern New Mexico, where the Farmington Field Office is based, their latest RMP was from 2003 that never analyzed fracking. And fracking is a combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Because they never analyzed it, it's illegal. But the way they have gotten around this, they continue to approve drilling permits rather than doing a thorough environmental impact statement for, as required by NEPA. They do what's called these little mini EAs, environmental assessments, and they continually issue FONSIs. These are findings of no significant impact for oil and gas development on people's public health, air quality, water quality, or anything. And that's how they're able to circumvent this process. And they use that same exact process for holding these lease cells. And the BLM, they're not under any obligation to hold these quarterly lease cells. They can actually use it at their own discretion. But now with the Trump administration and their energy dominance policy, it's almost like they must hold these quarterly lease cells. And the way that process is started is that oil and gas companies will nominate parcels in an area, in a region, in this case in the greater Chaco region, and also throughout New Mexico. But then they have to make sure that there is a process for the public and for the tribes to comment on some of their issues and concerns with nominating these parcels. But they have started to really cut and drastically reduce those comment periods and opportunities to get our concerns out there. You can no longer email or fax comments. They have to be either mail or hand delivered. And this December 7th, there's going to be a lease sale of over nearly 100,000 acres of land in New Mexico. But I also want to talk about how, this kind of a federal oversight at the BLM level really doesn't take into account or consider public health and safety at all in its decisions. And one example is the explosion that happened in 2016 in Anizi. There was an oil and gas site that exploded. It was 330 feet from residents' homes. 55 people had to be evacuated. And 330 feet is really close when you think about it. The federal setbacks are 660 feet. That's not much better either. But what these operators will do is they'll unitize these lease agreements and they'll pull them. And then once they do that, it falls under the jurisdiction of the State Regulatory Authority, New Mexico Oil Conservation Division. They'll apply for state waivers and allow for these sites to be 330 feet from someone's home. I then wanted to just kind of talk and give you some information as well about kind of our State Regulatory Authority, NMOCD. They also fell significantly in ensuring public health and safety with regard to oil and gas development. And since 2009, the NMOCD hasn't been able to actually collect fines when oil companies violate any type of operation. NMOCD has to go through the Attorney General, but that's not being pursued to collect these. Minimum fines for violators are only $300. That's really inexpensive and doesn't provide any type of incentive for oil and gas to behave properly, like a good neighbor. And also just, another startling fact in a report from Earthworks, they found that in 2010, there were only 12 inspectors for oil and gas sites. These are active, also abandoned wells, to oversee 53,000 wells. So that's like 4,000 wells that one inspector has to monitor. The ratio is probably a little bit worse today. And some of these wells are inspected only once every 5 years. So because of the failings of our federal government and our state rules to regulate oil and gas, it's also really important for local municipalities, and they do have the power to regulate oil and gas on that level. And I just wanted to also talk a little bit more about Sandoval County. Maybe some of you are aware of it, but they're in the process of updating their comprehensive zoning ordinance to address expanded oil and gas development in the county. And what an ordinance is, it's a regulatory document, and it's designed to promote the health and well-being of its citizens. And what counties can do, they can actually require oil companies to do monitoring of public and private wells. They can require them to do it so many times a year. They can require the financial history of a company, which is really important. In 2015, there was a company known as Sandridge that applied for an exploratory drilling permit just outside of Rio Rancho. But that company withdrew the application because they went bankrupt. They can also require for operators to maintain roads, and road destruction is also a problem kind of in the Tri-Chapter area as well. And they can require operators to have emergency plans in place for when accidents do happen. In the case of the Anizi explosion in July, there weren't even emergency plans in place. People didn't really know where to go. And the county, they're still in the process of developing this. So as the Sierra Club, what we try to do, for one, we try to provide as much information that people need to know so that they can take action. In the case of the December lease sale that's coming up, we've tried to make it easy to translate this really restrictive process for being able to comment and, digest it and make it easy for you to be able to comment at that opportunity. And some of the things the club has been working on to help support as well is with citizen science, to be able to document and monitor and do some air testing. There is something known as a health impact assessment. And what a health impact assessment is designed to do, it's designed to look at if there are certain issues that development might impact on a community, say air quality, or with the case of oil and gas, high noise levels are a problem. A health assessment kind of documents that and puts it in, to a digestible kind of document that you can then present to the Bureau of Land Management to take into consideration within their resource management plan, an environmental impact statement. So those are some of the things that we're involved in, but I just wanted to kind of give you that broader overview of how this all works together.
I'm going to do a little bit of the same. So Wild Earth Guardians works across, at least our climate and energy program, we work across 11 western states challenging coal and oil and gas. We call ourselves a Keep It in the Ground group. So with the perspective of coal versus oil and gas, I can tell you that there's a lot of regulatory capacity. There are the federal regulatory agencies and multiple federal laws that manage coal, for instance. Oil and gas, not so much. We call it the Wild West in terms of regulatory policy, and that's really because there are very few laws that govern oil and gas development, except for the Mineral Leasing Act of 1912. Yeah, 1912.
18,
Yeah,
maybe 18.
maybe even 1812.
No, 19.
That's how all these policies are, though.
Yeah, and the thing, Sam mentioned, development was starting to explode in 2013 in the Greater Chaco area. So what Guardians and also the club and many of the organizations that are in our coalition do is we work from a litigious angle, and we work on the administrative and policy lenses, and like Maya said, we try to make it digestible because it's very confusing. And we come at it from an angle that is regional as well. So Wild Earth Guardians, we started working on the Greater Chaco campaign in 2014. What we see happening in Greater Chaco, we see happening all across the West, the Trump energy dominance agenda, but also, frankly, every administration's agenda of leasing public lands, public minerals, what should be the property of every American. And like Maya said, also in the case of the Bureau of Land Management, they also manage tribal resources. And in New Mexico, there's two basic areas where oil and gas development's happening, and that's in the northwest and the southeast. I'm going to show you a map, this little thing here, that's Chaco with a 10-mile buffer and a 20-mile buffer. And let me be clear that that's Chaco National Historical Cultural Park. That is not Chaco UNESCO World Heritage, and that is not the boundaries of all of Greater Chaco culture, where there is great houses that span the four corner states. I'm going to click this layer. So first, I want to tell you that this map that I'm showing you is available online at climatewest.org. But the layer that I click is unfortunately, this gets a little scary, it takes a while to load, the active wells in New Mexico. And as that loads, so in oil and gas drilling, it's really bad. Oil and gas drilling used to be pretty simple. It was about vertical wells is what they called them. So they drilled about 1,000 to 2,000 feet into the ground, extracted oil or gas. Most of that easy fossil fuels is now gone. They're having to go deeper into the ground to extract the same, more frankly, viscous. The fossil fuels that we're getting now are heavier, they're heavier sedimented. And instead of going 1,000 or 2,000 feet now, they're called horizontal drilling. This technology happened in about 2008. So now they're able to go 7,000 to 10,000 feet into the ground, make a 90-degree angle, and go out as far as 2 miles in every direction drilling. And that's what's different about the activity that's happening in Greater Chaco now. So there are 40,000, you can see all of these wells in New Mexico. Just so you know, for your reference, you can click on, it's still loading, any one of these wells, and you can get a little bit more information about them, their ID number, how deep they are, when they were drilled, but these are all active wells, so it's a fun thing to play on. There are 40,000, about 20,000 active, 40,000 oil and gas wells in the northern part of the San Juan Basin, and with the advent of horizontal drilling, they're able to go further south and east, access areas that were previously considered economically unfeasible to be able to extract from. And in fact, that's what they said in their 2003 resource management plan. There will be no drilling in the Greater Chaco area because it's economically unfeasible and technologically impossible. No longer true anymore. So if we go to this area, you can see there's a lot of development, and those different colors are oil versus gas wells. Getting closer and closer within the boundaries of the park. There was a question about what is our federal representatives doing, and there is a bill right now in Congress sponsored by Senators Udall and Heinrich to create a 10-mile buffer around the national park and to withdraw federal minerals from leasing within that area. As you can see from this map, there is already drilling within the 10 miles, and there's certainly drilling within the 20 miles, and we tend to say a buffer is pretty arbitrary. I'm gonna unclick this because it makes everything bad. What I'm gonna show you now is sort of what the genesis of leasing in this area. So this is January 2014. I'm gonna throw on October 2014. These are lease sale parcels that the BLM has been proposing to lease. So basically the process is industry says, we want to lease in this area. BLM looks at it, they says, okay, we're going to offer it for sale on a lease sale, and then there's 4 opportunities more or less for the public to protest. Now, as Maya said, it's getting increasingly more difficult for the public to protest. You know, we used to be able to send emails in, now like she said, they're only accepting them via snail mail and hand delivery. And also, the reason that the samples that you have in front of you have this list of all these numbers is they're actually saying if you don't list the specific parcel number, your comment doesn't count. So there's 2 things going on right now. The administration is making it increasingly more difficult for the public to engage in public lands management. We used to have 30 days for these comments. Now we have 10 days for these comments. New Mexico specifically has, frankly, has eliminated at least 1 stage of public process. And we, as I mentioned, we were showing up in person at these lease sales. These happened at the state office in Santa Fe. We were showing up in person and we were actually getting them to postpone or cancel, or we're becoming quite a ruckus. And in response, they moved all the lease sales online. So now there is a third-party private agency that is managing oil and gas leases. And I'm just gonna keep sort of showing you, these were the parcels in March, how development is continuing. December. So right now, our federal delegation did work to remove about 1,000 acres from the December lease sale that were within 10 miles of the park. There's still close to 50,000 acres that are up for sale this December, and even more coming up in March 2019. When you zoom out, you can see that part of the reason that we're in this cycle too, that there's a lot of development happening in the southeastern part of the state. And you may not know that New Mexico now has the world's largest oil field. Bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than the Gulf. The Permian Basin in southeastern New Mexico is now the world's largest producing oil field. And it's crazy. And there is a huge issue industry-wide right now about what to do with the produced fracking wastewater. As you may know, horizontal drilling requires an immense amount of water used at high pressure to literally fracture up the rock below so that you can be able to extract the oil and gas. Once that water is used for oil and gas, it's unusable, but because the fracking activities are exempted from the Clean Water Drinking Act, thanks to our former president, Dick Cheney, we don't even know what the chemicals in chemical cocktail used for fracking is. I can tell you right now, this is really scary, why this is all really important and taken in sort of a big picture, is there are efforts right now that try to propose New Mexico to be the pilot state to figure out how we introduce fracking water into our hydrological cycle. Those actions are happening. We'll see them come up this legislative session. So when we talk about how oil and gas is impacting us on a federal level, it's where the Bureau of Land Management, that is supposed to serve the interest of all Americans and is really working to just grease the skids to try to privatize every last inch of public land available, they are making lands available, and then on state and county levels, we're figuring out how it gets managed, sort of where the money goes. There's some royalty issues, but it's actually state level, federal, and then on the county level is how oil and gas gets touched in our state. So we're going to talk about calls to action in a little bit. I think that's it. So the only thing I wanted to add in terms of, Maya mentioned that this is a self-regulating industry. They inspect themselves. The only data that we have about how dangerous they are comes from the Oil Conservation Division. That's reporting 4 spills a day on average for oil and gas in New Mexico. So it's a lot to watchdog, and I'll tell you really clearly that the administration is trying at every step to make sure that your voice doesn't count. We recently made a request for public hearings around this December lease sale, just asking for the public to have an opportunity to voice their opinion in a public forum to Bureau of Land Management. And they told us firstly that we didn't have the authority to ask for that hearing, and then secondly that there's nothing new that could have been brought up around Greater Chaco issues. Why? So this is very important because this is for very many reasons. But there's an all-out assault across the country related to oil and gas. And what's unique about, in terms of the efforts that we've made, we've been able to win or make progress in Greater Chaco where we haven't in the rest of the country. So last March, it was small, but Secretary Zinke did defer close to 4,000 acres, or the entire lease sale last March. And that was the first time that this administration did that anywhere. And they did it because they said that cultural consultation hasn't happened yet. Cultural consultation still has not happened yet, and they're moving forward with additional leases. But we are able to make progress where nowhere else in the country is making any progress. And sometimes that is about cultural preservation. I put that in quotations because it gives you a lot of things. And we're trying really hard to move that conversation to public health as well, because we can't just be taking care of places without taking care of people, and understanding that the link and really the whole impact of oil and gas is having. And as Teresa mentioned, the link between public education, we have a $300 million surplus in our budget this year because of oil and gas money, but that's not reliable. That money won't be there forever. Our schools can't count on it. And so we're sort of holding children in the state hostage to oil and gas revenues too. This map is available. climatewest.org is a really good, useful thing to plug in Chaco, and there's lots of maps and letters linked there. And I'm going to pass it over to our lawyer to tell you more about all of the cases we're working on.
Thanks. Well, litigation is really the last resort that you go to when all of the other things you've tried haven't worked. And Maya talked about the different public involvement processes involved at state and federal levels. We've already talked about the shrinking of a comment period from 30 days to 10 days, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's usually what's happened here is that folks, since I became an attorney back in 2008, have been meeting with BLM in Farmington even before the fracking boom happened, saying, we know this is coming, you need to do something about it. And BLM was kind of like, okay, maybe we will, or it's not happening yet, or they were really kicking the can down the road, but there was a lot of involvement before the first lawsuit was brought by a lot of groups and people in this room as well, trying to meet with the agency and trying to affect that change through the existing processes, existing mechanisms that were in place. But of course, the fracking boom happened, and in about 2014 and 2015, when all of these drilling permits started hitting and BLM was approving all of these drilling permits, was when the first lawsuit was filed. And so Wild Earth Guardians, San Juan Citizens Alliance, Diné Citizens, Diné Care, and the Natural Resources Defense Council were the plaintiffs on that first lawsuit and sued BLM and the Department of Interior for the at that point it was about 300 drilling permits that BLM had issued. We amended the complaint a couple of times and we're somewhere closer to 400 drilling permits to do this kind of drilling, the horizontal drilling, multi-stage fracturing, the fracking that everybody talks about. And BLM had been doing, and Maya referred to it as these mini EAs, meaning that they would do an environmental study one well at a time. So we'll do a study for this well and this well and this well. In the meantime, you have that map showing all of those wells. There's hundreds of them up there. But what happens when BLM does that is they say, well, this well has just a small amount of air emissions, and so there's not really any kind of significant environmental impact, or it's not going to result in health impacts, because this well has a tiny amount of emissions. This well has a tiny amount, this one, this one, this one. So it's basically like death by 1,000 cuts. You're always just looking at it one well at a time. BLM has never analyzed the cumulative impacts of the air emissions, or any kind of air emissions, potential water contamination, all of the things that we talk about with respect to the impacts that are happening from this drilling. And they go one well at a time. And so that's why they produce all these findings of no significant impact, because they're just looking at one. They look at it in isolation. And so the lawsuit challenged BLM for doing this under the National Environmental Policy Act. claiming that BLM was just basically diluting all of these impacts from drilling by just looking at everything, analyzing everything one well at a time. But we also raised claims under the National Historic Preservation Act saying basically the same thing, like, hey BLM, we're not saying this one well you drilled right here is going to impact Chaco Canyon. We're saying that these 400 plus or 380 or whatever they are, they're probably well over 400 since the litigation started. All of this drilling combined is going to impact the cultural sites on the Chaco landscape. And so you should have consulted with the State Historic Preservation Officer over the impacts of this drilling on cultural sites. Now, because none of the plaintiffs were tribal entities, we couldn't raise claims that BLM needed to consult with tribes, because those are claims that only tribal entities can bring. But we were still trying to get at that issue of failure to just pay attention to impacts to cultural sites out there with this lawsuit. And so the first thing that we did in 2015 is we moved to enjoin all of the drilling that was currently happening. So we asked the court to just temporarily cease all the development of these well pads until our litigation was completed. And that's a pretty typical first step that you take. Because when you file a lawsuit, it takes a long time for it to play out. And in the meantime, BLM had approved all of these drilling permits, which meant drilling could be happening. And we lost that. I mean, Teresa mentioned earlier the importance of the judges and the judge that's assigned to the case. So since this is being taped, that's all I'll say about it. We lost that. And so then we tried to get the 10th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals to overturn that judge's decision and still put a temporary halt on drilling, and the 10th Circuit refused to do that. So we went forward, we briefed the merits of the case, and of course the same judge we lost found that it was okay for BLM to do things the way it was doing it. Maya had mentioned the resource management plan, the RMP amendment. We also said, look, BLM, you said that you've never analyzed the impacts of this drilling. I mean, that's part of the reason why we sued the agency. And the judge still thought it was fine for the agency to continue to approve drilling, and while at the same time, the agency claimed to be studying the impacts of that drilling. That's not the way NEPA works. You know, you don't put the cart before the horse. You first study the environmental impacts, you tell the public what the results of the study was, and then you make a decision about whether or not you're going to allow that drilling to go forward. And we're kind of, BLM is has that process completely reversed and is now coming up with ways to cut out the public. So we did appeal the merits of that decision to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. It's currently being briefed. And as part of that litigation in the 10th Circuit, there was an amicus brief filed. That means a friend of the court brief by APCG and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, specifically addressing the issues of damage to cultural sites out there, and also talking about community concerns as well. And so we have that support, and we think that will really, that amicus brief will really show the 10th Circuit why this is such an important issue, why it's just not a box-checking kind of process, but what the impacts are out there to cultural properties and to the people that live out there and live amongst that development. So we're thinking that we will have oral argument on that case sometime in March of 2019, and we will see if we could this time get the 10th Circuit to really recognize what's happening out there, and hopefully then, at least even if it's temporary, cancel all of those drilling permits, and BLM will have to start over. So that's the result we're hoping for with that particular litigation. So that's really the big lawsuit that's been pending and ongoing since 2015. And going forward, we also, the same folks that filed this litigation over the drilling permits, we've also been tracking the leasing decisions, and I think importantly, this idea, the short comment period. So everything that's happened as a result of that. And that happened because of something called an instructional memorandum that BLM issued in late January 2018 that said a number of things. But amongst the many bad things it said, protest periods are going to be shortened from 30 days to 10 days. BLM isn't even going to do these mini EAs. So even an EA, an environmental assessment, was better than nothing, but one of the things that memorandum said is, we're going to look at the existing environmental studies, and if they seem adequate in their discussion of impacts, we are going to issue, it's called a DNA, a determination of NEPA adequacy. It's just a way of saying, we're not going to do anything. We're not even going to do these little mini EAs. We're just going to look at whatever documents we have, and if they seem okay to us, that's what we're going to do. And then we are going to go ahead and hold the lease sales. And there was a question earlier, the first panel that was up here, about when BLM does these kind of things, how important it is to comment on that. The thing is, an instructional memorandum, this is like guidance. This is something the agency does internally. They produce this piece of paper and they send it to all of the field offices and say, this is the way you're going to do things. Had it been an actual change in the regulations, BLM would have had a public comment period saying, this is a rule we're thinking of putting in place. And the public would have had a chance to comment. But the way that they did it was through this kind of guidance memorandum that is really hard to get at, because BLM claims this is just guidance. This memorandum hasn't changed how we comply with NEPA. This is just some guidance to make things go quicker. And so that is why it is really important when you submit these comments, on this comment form, there is something on the back that says, hey, you're not giving us enough time. I think it's really important to say that in your own words to BLM. And the way that Cheyenne talked about the process of needing to have things translated and how long it takes to even go back to the community and talk to them about these things BLM issues, that is all really important for you to put in your comments that you're going to be sending to BLM on October 31st, because in order to be able to sue the agency for stuff like that, you first have to make sure you inform them in these comments. So while it may seem frustrating because we all comment on these things and BLM doesn't respond or BLM ignores them, it is important for litigation to show that you put the agency on notice that what it was doing was wrong. And so one of the targets in upcoming litigation is going to be this instructional memorandum for exactly the reasons that Cheyenne had talked about. This is what happens when you shorten that comment period. Sure, you're keeping groups like Wild Earth Guardians and the Sierra Club out, but when you keep the local communities out, the people that are directly impacted, that's going to be compelling for a court, because people are busy. People that live in these communities are trying to figure out how do you comment. I mean, they've changed the comment procedure, saying something like, well, you can't do it via email anymore, you have to do it in person, or you have to write letters, you have to list all of the parcels, you have to write it in just such a certain way. That really is intended to scare people away, to keep them from commenting, to deter and sort of make people feel like, well, what's the use in doing this? Because I've only got this short period of time, I have to check all these boxes when I comment. You can do things like this. You can fill in things like this, so at least it's before BLM, and then when it comes time to challenge them for these things that they've done, they can come back and say, nobody told us, or we gave you an opportunity and you didn't comment. So that's the process piece of this that folks are going to be looking to attack in the next round of litigation.
Is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm Eleanor Bravo, I'm with Food and Water Watch, and we've tried to engage our membership on a national level. And because Chaco Canyon is the best example for the abuse of public lands, and our membership is extremely interested. Does the local BLM office, does New Mexico care about what people in the nation think?
I mean, Mexico doesn't care what any.
No, I was gonna say, they don't care, but the thing about it is, you gotta look at the next step, is that if you wanna force them, and especially with this administration, to force agencies to do anything, they're gonna have to be taken to court. And so, the court's gonna wanna know and see that the people, that anybody, whether, not just the local people, but in terms of who's interested in this, they're gonna wanna see that BLM was put on notice by the public, that this
Well, I'll add to
process was
that
not
too.
working.
So we actually know, so we mentioned that there's a lot of development happening in 2 areas of the state, and one sort of spiting the other. But industry analysts, in talking about New Mexico industry profits, actually start to compute what the cost of activism is. So because there are folks in Greater Chaco that are organizing, that are standing up, that are creating a headache for those decision makers, it actually does, it does come to play with the cost of doing business for operators, because they have to contend with dealing with us annoying public citizens that care about our right to live. It also comes to play in the sense that we wouldn't have the attention of our federal delegation. We wouldn't have Michelle Lujan Grisham, we wouldn't have Heinrich, we wouldn't have Udall, we wouldn't have Ben Ray Lujan talking about this if not for y'all making a big deal out of it, doing the phone calls, making it public, and some of that, like Sam was saying, no, BLM in this administration exists to grease the skids for industry, and what we have to continue to do is be the moral high ground and talk about really the communities that we want to be fighting for, the kinds of lives we want to be living, and inserting a new narrative, because what's also, I mean, this is happening so fast. We had this new technology that happened less than a decade ago that's been out, and it's unregulated, and it is rampant and like the Wild West in our community, and New Mexico might be the first state to figure out how we deal with fracking wastewater in our hydrological cycle in our rivers, and God forbid in our agricultural uses. So why does it matter? Part of the reason that I've heard Sam say this before is we show up, we try to create these relationships with local communities so that there are bridges, because Sam, because what have you been driving around all week to 5 different meetings already? Sam's only one person, he can only be so many places, but when his message is supported and echoed by folks in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and where there's a lot of population and where we have a lot of our senators' offices located, or where our congressional, frankly, all of our Congress people's offices I have, besides 1 or 2.
Yeah, okay, because Cheyenne, I don't know if you're still here, but you're the one who first brought this up, and the format that it had to be in, and you were talking, like I was really struck. I mean, I can't go and canvas with you this week, but one of the things, I do see the power of like social media, and like for me, like a really simple task to do would be to take this image, this interactive image, and then also share this, and to the people who I talk to say, okay, this is the document you have to print, you have to sign, and you have to send in before the deadline, which is coming up. And if all of us, wherever we stand, if we get 5 to 10 human beings to do this action, it's real. And if we ask them to get 5 to 10 human beings, if they have like 4 or 5 days left, this is real. And it's really, my question for you, or for the Pueblo Action Alliance, is do you need copies, do you need to know who sent it in?
Yes, so on the back of the sheet, you have to fill out your name, your address, and all that.
But this is if we hand it to you.
Yes, so, and like Rebecca had said earlier, that these have to be delivered either by hand or snail mail.
Right.
And so we, and we're gonna talk about these next steps, and so that this protest comment period ends on the 31st, right? Which is where we're physically going to be handing these in, but I see Mario in the back.
Yeah, so usually what we hear from BLM themselves, they just put them in there's an NGO file. Let's put it here and throw it away, right? Well, as it's designed, does it force them to actually read and respond to all these comments?
Let me respond to that. So I was going to say, one thing is that it is really important that people write something under the supporting comment line. Because if you just sign it, it doesn't matter whether, you know, it's a local community or an NGO, they'll count them all up and they'll say, we got 2,000 form letters. But if you put something unique on the back under supporting comment, or if you want to handwrite it on a separate sheet of paper and staple it to it, then they can't blow it off as easily because there's a unique comment.
Yeah,
So that's what's
and so
important
just
too.
to add to that, in terms of the success of the Greater Chaco work, is so this is typically a really wonky process, and even though organizations can have people send emails in, BLM actually is required to post your protest online and list it. And typically, about a dozen across the country, these agencies will get about a dozen protests. Technical protests is what they call them, for each lease sale at this stage. Last session for the March, for the one that we got deferred, we had a record-breaking 439 public protests mailed in, and that's because it was things like this that were done. And BLM, first they tried to dismiss 200 of those, 200 plus of those public comments. We followed up with them, we had those notes, they had to list it forward, and what that does is really demonstrate the volume of citizens taking their time to do this really arduous, cumbersome process because they care about how their public lands and resources are managed.
Elise?
Is there any plan for someone to collect these in different communities, to have like a delivery so that if we're able to get, 50 of them and Sierra Club's able to get some and other people that we can gather them and hand deliver so that we make sure that they're on their deck?
So remember, we only found out about this the 22nd when it happened, so we're working really fast. Yes, the 31st, Halloween, is the deadline. We will be hand delivering these in an action. We will be getting that information on Facebook under Frack Off Chaco soon. We might have a Halloween component. And then also, if you are collecting, here's what we suggest, and we're happy to do this for you. If you're collecting a fair amount of materials, you send them certified mail. And if you can also scan them and send them to myself and Maya, we'll put our information out there too. We're going, or at least tell us how many you sent in, because on that delivery on Wednesday the 31st, we want to try to make a big media splash and say, here's the amount of protests, and make sure that we've captured them so that everyone's voice is counted.
So I think there was also a March 2017 lease sale that also happened. And they sold, I forgot how many it was, but Kendra's grandma's affected by that because she sits on trust. And so even though we're talking about these comments and these processes, BLM does not follow them. They just restrict them. And that's what we're experiencing now. So even though we are talking about the process, we have to also be careful that they're willing to change anything without even telling us. And they'll move forward with the lease sales. And so I was just like wondering, and then it goes to it goes to the circuit court, and then the judge denies it. So at that point, when a judge denies all of these claims, and doesn't acknowledge our sacred sites, and doesn't want to acknowledge our concerns, what happens then? If a judge turns you away, what happens then? And what are ways? Maybe we can have this discussion here soon, like right now. Yeah. But I just want folks to think about that too, because oftentimes, yes, this works. Yes, in the March lease sale was deferred, but then they came back more with 40,000 more acres, and so they just hit even harder right after that. So I just want to put that out there.
Yes, I got here a little late, but I'm glad I made it for this panel discussion because this is what I was thinking about. As soon as I saw this information come out, how they shortened the protest period. And when I read that they wanted us to cross our T's and dot our I's and do all this like they wanted, and they want hand delivered, I thought, well, this is just an idea. And I'm really impressed with the whole thing with the Entrada and how that was shut down.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, okay, so if that's what they want, what if thousands of New Mexicans showed up to hand deliver these on a certain day to their offices? It's an idea. Just an idea.
I just have a question. When you write down the well,
and you want to make a comment, do you have to have a specific information about that well?
It's all here.
Okay.
All the wells, the 113 years.
It's a parcel, not a parcel.
Okay.
Yeah, so we have like tables outside full of resources, and this is a good, valuable resource. It's a one sheet on all the actions that you could personally take in anticipation for this next lease in December.
So when you write a comment, you can talk about the parcel? You have to have specific information about each parcel?
Well, we have it, it's already listed. This is what BLM wants. They want us to list the actual number of each nominated parcel.
Okay.
Yeah. So this document right here is like a template. It's a legitimate document that you can put your personalized, and that's another thing, is like it's really important to have that personalized message there. And so
we don't have to worry about numbers and all that. It's already done.
It's already done. We've digested all the information, all the restrictions, and we put them in this form that we
We actually have hard copies of that sheet that Julie was talking about at the table outside, so if you guys can grab one on your way out.
And if you want to fill it in tonight, you can actually hand it to any of us and we'll make sure it gets delivered.
The electronic
Do you have a mechanism for us to take these to our friends, bring them back, and then give them to you?
yeah, so if you're in Albuquerque, you can either give them to Maya at Sierra Club. Their office is on Stanford and Lit.
It's located at 2315 Blood Avenue. You can go on the website.
And we're in the process of posting it on our Frack Off Chaco web form too. It'll happen.
Or the Southwest Organizing Project, that's where Pueblo Action Alliance's office is as well, and we can also get those to them for that action on the 31st.
Yeah, and so if you guys want to email us at coactionlines@gmail or just message us through Facebook, we can make sure that coordination happens and I can meet you at our office.
One more thing, the people who are running the candidates, so Heinrich is in town, Michelle DeFon is in town, Ben Ray's in town, and then we've got a bunch of other candidates, and they're going all over the place. Is there any possibility that we could show up in mass and hand them our forms to them and make us think about what we need to be really paying attention to this?
Well, like mentioned earlier, like they're like on our side. You know, we're really lucky here that we have a congressional delegation that has like been responsive to like our asks. But if you look on the sheet again, we actually, EPA is they're organizing a symposium in Lybrook area. What the purpose of this symposium is to have the federal entities engage with the public, the community. And so we have, when myself, Sam, and Kendra were in DC, we personally invited the staffers and, you know, to come to this symposium, to be there, so that way they can engage with community members as well.
I am on my farm today, now I get the idea that anyone can open it. Should I do another one and give it to you?
Yes.
And make a copy of it too.
So if you give it to us, what we will do is send them certified mail, so there's a tracking receipt that we can hold them accountable to in future litigation, and we'll also hand deliver them. So still do it on your own, but we're trying to coordinate the efforts so that we can make a bigger collective impact mostly on the youth.
And don't forget, there's another lease sale March of 2019, and the comment period is a 10-day early in January. The scoping period just ended the 19th. Comment period is beginning of January. We're going to go through this whole thing again.
Eleanor Bravo let us know that there is a produced water conference happening in Santa Fe on November 14th and 15th. It's for all the industry bigwigs to figure out how they can spew their wastewater on us. And because it's a big holdback, it's a big cost of them. They don't even talk about where they're getting the fresh water that they're ruining before they want to dump it on us. And I think it's a fabulous opportunity to show up. They're thinking this is the sweet little conference, all hunky-dory. And if a bunch of us show up and have signs like this, I think we can also get a big media play and let people know, everybody understands when water is ruined, it affects everything. I don't know how you all found out about this meeting, but we have frackoffchaco.org. We have Frackoff Chaco Instagram. We have Red Nation, we have Pueblo Action Alliance, all these places. If I will work with you guys and whoever else to see if we can put together a day. It's either going to be a Thursday or Friday in Santa Fe during the daytime. And we'll post it in just social media. But if you can amplify that, if you're not already on one of our Instagrams or Facebooks, please sign up because it's really effective. And it would be a hoot to show those bastards that we know what they're trying to do. Thank you.
What I was going to share with you was what Cheyenne mentioned, how far things have become and how messed up things have become. 2016, in the summer, we met BLM, 2 BLM representatives, community members, in Kendra Pinto's grandmother's living room. There were proposed parcels that were going to be leased, and we spoke with BLM representatives and told them to not do it. Don't do it, don't do it. Right there, they both agreed that they were going to withdraw those leases. We held them off for 2 years. That's how simple it used to be. We used to go over to Farmington field office and speak with the manager and do the same thing. He said, okay, I'll pull this one, I'll pull this one, and I'll pull this one back. Then about 2 years later, they're not going to do it anymore. He said, it's only the state director can do it. Then the state director says only DC can do it. But DC has no idea what's going down here. So that's how messed up things have become. And they're continuously playing musical chairs with the managers too. So you don't know who's coming in, but they're all coming in from the south of New Mexico. Just trying to give you a little idea of how much things have changed.
Well, I just want to thank our panel. Sorry, we have one.
I apologize. The way I understand the whole issue of why we don't know how much water the fracking industry is using is because they're not required to put meters on their hoses and pumps as they're pumping water. Apparently that was a rule that was passed during the Bush administration during the last year and a half while Dick Cheney was still vice president. What I'm curious about, and I guess the question is, since that was a rule that was created during that time, and now different states have obviously said, okay, we don't have to enforce these rules like farmers and ranchers have to meter their water, right? So John D'Antonio, who's the water engineer, basically doesn't require these oil and gas. So what kind of legal recourse do we have from a state point of view to subvert or mitigate these federal rules that don't give any regulation with regards to the water that these oil and gas companies are just taking without us knowing how much they're taking from our aquifers or from any of our sources? So I'm just wondering, has that question been explored? Because if there's a state component that we could use from the basis of states' rights having some precedence over federal rights, I'm just wondering if we can figure out a way to do that, because New Mexico has so little water. This issue of the oil and gas companies not having to meter how much water they're taking from any water source in the state, that just seems to me like something we ought to be also addressing. And I apologize if it's not within the line of this agenda, but just a question. Thank you.
I think the little bit that I know about it is that the oil and gas companies, when they they can try to find somebody from whom they can buy groundwater rights. But I don't know a lot of the details of what's been happening up in the Farmington area, because also what I've heard is instead of using fresh water, they're using this fracking foam, which of course is a bunch of dangerous chemicals. It doesn't mean it's better one way or another. But that they've been doing that to get around the issue of water shortages. But they can try to purchase groundwater rights from existing water rights holders.
They do have to demonstrate that they have access to the water needed. So again, in Greater Chaco, I mean, this is, believe it or not, Greater Chaco wells on average use less water than fracking wells across the country. The numbers you typically hear are 3 to 4, sometimes 7 million gallons of fresh water per well for fracking. In New Mexico, it's about 1.3, 1.2 million gallons, and that's because we've got this fracking foam and also nitrogen fracking that they're doing in the area. So it's still an issue of water. They're trying to get around our drought area by putting more chemicals in the ground.
I can speak to them.
Yeah.
They don't have to demonstrate a water source. In Sandoval County, when Sandwich came in, they were issued every permit that they needed without demonstrating a water source. They claimed they were going to buy it from the city of Rio Rancho. We walked into the city office, the utility office, and they said, no, we've never made an agreement with Sandwich, so they don't have to demonstrate. And Margarita, I want to tell you that we have been trying to address this in the legislature, but what we're coming up against is that it's discriminatory. In other words, our ask is discriminatory against a private company because they have the right to buy whatever they need to perform whatever the industry needs to do. So, we are going to have to address it on a local level because we're not getting any kind of support on a national level.
What's upsetting about that is that precedes what the needs of farmers and ranchers who are being required
People
to.
don't have even water to drink.
But sometimes they're going to be, the water source is laden with high levels of arsenic. So it's actually, they're going to be mining a toxic waste dump already, it's natural. They're going to put chemicals in it and they're going to dump it on surface wells or injection line and re-injecting in other places arsenic-laden water with the chemicals on top of all of it. So that was the standard.
What has happened in the Four Corners area is that before slick water fracking became well-known in 2008, a kind of fracking was done with saline, and now the water tables in the Four Corners area are super salinated. Nobody even knows what the natural form of salination is in the Four Corners area.
Right.
I just have a quick question, kind of pertaining to the farms and working with some of the tribes, especially those of us that have ranchers and farmers. Is there any detail or reference they can state to tribes as sovereign water right holders or Acequia land holders who have other, sovereign rights, even presidents of the state, that can either complement litigations, complement protests, especially being in Sandoval County, because I'm tribal, I'm from Jemez. The amount of farmers that we have and the people that we can ask to take part on that end of things, because that's a law that I don't think even a lot of New Mexicans, much less tribal members, understand, in our right to water. And I've always wondered why that doesn't come up and why that can't be the firmest no, before anything else in these things, because we're, primary landholders and caretakers to that. And there are additional Acequia landholders who are historically tied through various treaties, who have the Spanish and descendancy all the way down to Mexico, who share that right as well. And so is that of any precedence in current litigation, or is it in any inclusion to it, and how can we include it in some of this, because especially in Sandoval County where some of these parcels, that's our water, and that's not only for people's economic livelihood, but to our culture and how we
Yeah, I was going to say, it hasn't been part of the ongoing litigation, but any kinds of issues like that need to be raised with BLM. We haven't raised it with them, but the more that you kind of build that record with those kinds of issues, then going forward, it's there and it's in the record, and we can start to figure out what's the right way to bring litigation associated with that issue. It should definitely be raised.
on my farm, I'm a rancher. Yeah, I'm from Chicago.
If I could share something and take it away, because obviously it's a multi-pronged issue in terms of state, federal, all kinds of issues, and, you know, the changes that are coming out now, and obviously the present administration, but kind of going back to the regulatory stuff. Several years ago, when the oil industry came to the Santa Fe area, and obviously with the money and resources there, they quickly shut them out with a very strong regulatory ordinance. And then they went to what they were calling the playpen, which is my county, Mora County, and San Miguel County. So we've been involved in some of that stuff, and it's been a little divisive because in the end, San Miguel County passed a regulatory ordinance. It's got some issues, but I think it fairly follows pretty much the Santa Fe ordinance in a lot of ways. Mora County, those of you that have kept up with that stuff know there's been a lot of division, a lot of outside entities came in and actually, instead of creating unity and kind of education, created a lot of division in the community. However, Mora County will also be probably finishing up a regulatory ordinance at the beginning, if not by the end of the year, by the early part of the year. So I think it might be interesting to look at what can be used there. Dr. Freilich out of California was a useful person. There's still problems with it, but with those regulatory ordinances. But I think when you compare it to kind of what was being kind of proposed before, I mean, it's one of those things to just to be cautionary about those things. And again, it's organizing, right? Because it's interesting to say 1,000 people, but it's another thing to really organize that and be consistent, because things like this take a lifetime. They don't necessarily get resolved in a year or two, because the issues, whether it be uranium mining or anything else, and the uranium belt and the indigenous nations have been there, right? There are some things that could, you know, from what I understand, there's some things that was an environmental justice provision that was entered into the solid waste regulations, and I know it doesn't apply to these things, but I think those can be used to kind of think about things. The Rhino decision, it was another landfill decision, basically pushed the solid waste divisions to look at community and social and health impacts, not just technical issues, because the New Mexico Environment Department, as well as the federal government, has had the practice of, as long as the technical parts are filled in and all the blanks are filled in, and they will take years helping the industry do that and do it correctly, then they just approve it, right? So again, the Rhino decision was very important in New Mexico in terms of environmental justice. Now, in terms of environmental justice and organizing, I would suggest that as people go out and gather signatures, that you also make sure that those people most impacted and most close are very well represented, very clear in the direction of the organizing, and very present, because again, part of the mantra of the environmental justice is we speak for ourselves. So in order to be authentic in that case, it's important that the organizing really focus on that. Thank you for your work.
Like, Elaine's been a very great advocate for like what's going on in San Juan County. But unfortunately, we are over time. We can, you know, continue mingling after, but we're gonna have to start clearing out the room. But please, on your way out, please sign in so we can keep track of who's, you know, at these gatherings. Also, just please grab these resources, okay, that are on the tables outside, and how you can get involved, because as you've seen, all of these people, all the representatives from every different community have exerted immense amounts of labor, emotional labor, physical labor, and filling out something like this is a small ask but a huge help. So just want to say thank you for everybody that attended, and thank you to our
Big thank you to our Crack After House community members for being here too. Just like Sophia said, it's really important that we put them at the center and the forefront of this movement, and it's always Indigenous led. So we thank all of you guys for always being in support of Indigenous movements and being allies, and we appreciate that, and we hope that you guys will continue to support us and be there along with our frontline community members. Be sure to grab a zine. These are an awesome way to engage with the youth or any younger folks you might have in your family. These have pictures and quotes and messages about fracking that's happening in the community. But yes, please sign in, and thank you for coming.
My name is Lonnie Sinajini. I'm from Torreon, and I have a background in hydrology and I work in water research and regional planning. But yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself, and I know Mario and Cheyenne, and just like I've been in teaching and finally done, but just wanted to say that I'm interested in helping